My son called on a Tuesday morning, which should have been my first warning. He never calls on Tuesdays. He calls on Sundays, briefly, usually while the game is on, and I can hear the television in the background the whole time we talk. But that Tuesday, his voice was different. Warmer. Deliberate. The kind of warm that means someone wants something. "Mom," he said, "we've been thinking, and we really think it's time." I was standing at the kitchen counter, still in my robe, holding a mug of coffee I hadn't started drinking yet. Outside, the November light was thin and gray. I had nowhere to be that morning, which I'd been quietly looking forward to all week. "Time for what?" I asked. "For you to think about selling the house." I set the mug down. He kept talking. His wife had been looking at listings, he said. There was a nice complex about 12 minutes from their place. 1 bedroom, ground floor, no stairs, maintenance included. Very safe neighborhood. Great for someone my age. Someone my age. I'm 67. I walked a 5K in October. I still drive myself to every appointment, still keep my own garden, still make my own decisions. But apparently I had become someone my age without realizing it. "We'd feel so much better knowing you were close," he said. "And honestly, with the girls getting bigger, it would just make things so much easier." There it was, the girls, my granddaughters, 7 and 4. The real reason. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "Don't think too long, Mom. These units go fast." His name is Scott and I love him. I want to say that clearly, before I say anything else, because what happened between us doesn't cancel that. I loved him when he was a colicky baby, and I walked him up and down the hallway at 2 in the morning, singing the same 4 bars of a song I only half remembered. I loved him when he was 11, and broke my favorite lamp with a baseball and cried so hard he gave himself a stomachache. I loved him when he married Tanya 8 years ago, even though she looked at my centerpieces at the reception like she was doing me a favor by tolerating them. I loved him through all of it. I still do. But love is not the same as agreement, and it took me 67 years to understand that. After his call, I walked through the house slowly. Not dramatically at all. I just moved through the rooms the way you do when someone has suggested you leave a place and you want to remember why you haven't. I ran my hand along the doorframe in the hallway. This house has been mine for 22 years. I bought it 2 years after my husband passed, when I needed somewhere that was only mine, chosen only by me. Every curtain, every shelf, every dent in the baseboard. It isn't large or impressive, but it is completely, entirely mine. The idea of a 1-bedroom unit 12 minutes from Scott's house sat in my stomach like something I'd accidentally swallowed. I didn't call back right away. I watered my plants, I watched the evening news, I made soup. The next morning, Tanya called. "I just wanted to follow up about the conversation Scott had with you," she said. Which was interesting because she said it like she was following up about a proposal she had submitted, not like she was calling her mother-in-law. I told her, again, that I would think about it. She said she understood, and then she talked for 11 minutes about how the complex had a walking path and a community room and how it would be perfect for me. She used the word perfect 4 times. I counted. Before she hung up, she mentioned, casually, the way people mention things they've been planning to say for weeks, that it would be so wonderful if I were nearby for the girls, that they've been talking about pulling Zoe out of her after-school program to save money, and if I were just 12 minutes away, that wouldn't be necessary. I said goodbye. I sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. The furnace kicked on. The refrigerator hummed. Through the window, I could see my neighbor Herschel taking his dog out, the old retriever picking her way carefully through the frost on the grass. They wanted me to sell my house so I could be close enough to pick up their children. I thought, have I misunderstood something? Have I somehow agreed to this arrangement without realizing it? I did not misunderstand anything. What I did was keep a box. Not out of anger, not even out of any real intention. I've always been organized. I was a bookkeeper for 23 years, and the habit of documentation never fully leaves you. The box was a shoebox, actually, in the bottom of the closet behind my winter coats. I found it the Saturday after Tanya's call when I was looking for a different pair of boots and pulled it out by accident. Inside, receipts, printouts, notes I'd written to myself over the years. The time I gave Scott and Tanya $11,000 when they had a gap between closing and their mortgage approval and needed to cover the overlap. The time I bought a new transmission for Tanya's car because Scott had just started the new job and they couldn't swing it. The school fees I'd covered for Zoe's enrollment at her private kindergarten because the public school nearby had a wait list. The month I sent $1,200 because Scott said they'd had an unexpected tax bill and he was embarrassed to ask, but he didn't know who else to call. That last one I remembered clearly. He said, "Mom, you're the only one I can ask." And I said, of course, without hesitating. I went through the box for an hour. Then I made tea and looked out the window and thought about the word only. You're the only one I can ask. It had felt like closeness when he said it. Like trust. Like I was the person he turned to because I mattered most. Now I understood it differently. I was the only one he could ask because I was the one who always said yes. I should explain about Tanya, because she is not entirely a villain, and I want to be fair. She's efficient. She runs their household the way I ran the accounts at Kellerman and Bright, tightly, with very little margin for error. She loves my son, I believe that. She's a good mother to the girls, patient in the way that organized people are patient, methodically, strategically. She makes birthday cakes from scratch and signs the girls up for swim lessons and reads to them every night. But she has never once asked how I am doing unless Scott was in the room. And she has never, not once in 8 years, referred to my home as mine. It was always the house, like it was a transit point, a way station, not a place where a person actually lived. I don't think she dislikes me. I think she simply does not think about me, except as a resource. A grandmother available for pickup and drop-off. A phone number to call in emergencies. A line item in the family budget marked ongoing. The following Thursday, Scott called again. He had found an open house. Saturday at 11. He thought we could all go together, walk through, see what I thought. "I want you to be excited about this, Mom," he said. "It's a good thing." I told him I wasn't going to the open house. There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not going." "I've thought about what you asked, and the answer is no. I'm not selling the house." Another pause. Longer. "Mom, we've already talked to the agent about your property. She thinks you could get a good price in this market. You could walk away with real money." "I'm aware of what my house is worth," I said. "It's mine. I know what I paid for it, and I know what it means to me, and I'm not selling it." His voice changed. Not angry exactly. More like a door closing. "Okay," he said. "I hear you. But I hope you understand that this affects more than just you." I didn't respond. "We've been making plans around this, Mom. Real plans." I told Tanya, "I'm sorry if Tanya has made plans," I said. "But no one asked me before making them." He hung up a few minutes later, not rudely, but with a finality that felt like punctuation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was second-guessing myself. I knew I was right. But there's something particular about disappointing your child, even when your child is almost 40 and behaving badly. The feeling doesn't scale with reason. It just sits in your chest and presses. Tanya called the following Monday. She didn't waste time. "I want to talk to you about your role in this family," she said. And I noticed she said your role, not our relationship, not how things have been. Role. Like she was a manager and I had come in for a performance review. I let her talk. She said that families require flexibility, that being close to the girls was a gift I was choosing not to take, that my house was too big for one person, that Scott worried about me being alone, that the complex had a shuttle that went to the grocery store on Wednesdays. She said the word convenient 7 times in 15 minutes. Then she said, "And honestly, until you're willing to think about what's best for everyone, I think we need to take a step back from visits." I asked her to clarify. "I just think," she said, "that it might be better for the girls if we're not going back and forth right now. It confuses them when there's tension." I understood. If I didn't move, I didn't see my granddaughters. "That's your decision to make," I said. "It is," she said, and she hung up. I did not cry right away. That surprised me. I thought I would. I sat at the table instead and looked at my hands, and I thought, this is what the shoebox was always going to lead to. They didn't cut me off because I said no to the house. That was just the moment the ledger became visible. I'd been living in a relationship built on what I provided, and the second I stopped providing what was asked of me, I became a problem to be managed. I thought about the $11,000. I thought about Zoe's school fees. I thought about every holiday I'd driven the 3 hours round trip to their house, every meal I'd cooked while Tanya sat at the island scrolling her phone, every time Scott had said thanks, Mom, and patted my shoulder and walked away. I had been so grateful for the pat on the shoulder. That's what I couldn't quite reckon with. I'd been grateful. I called my friend Vivian that evening. We've been friends since our girls were in second grade together. Her daughter Pam and my daughter Carol, who lives in Portland now and calls every Sunday without fail. Vivian is the kind of person who does not say what you want to hear. She says what is true, and she says it without apology, which is precisely why I called her. I told her everything. The house, the role, the visits. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They pulled the kids like they were pulling a card out of your hand." Yes, exactly that. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm done trying to earn my place in their house." "Good," she said. "You should have been done a long time ago." We talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with Scott or Tanya. Her garden, a book I'd been reading, whether the diner on Garfield Street had actually improved, or whether we were just nostalgic. When we finally said goodnight, I felt something I hadn't expected. Light. Just slightly lighter. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, a legal pad, and my reading glasses. I was not a dramatic woman by nature. I did not make scenes or gestures, but I was a thorough one. I had been a bookkeeper for 23 years, and what a bookkeeper understands is this: everything must balance. What goes out must be accounted for. And if the columns don't balance, someone has been keeping bad records. I started writing. The $11,000, which I'd given as a gift and never asked about again. The car transmission, $1,400. Zoe's school enrollment fee, $1,800 first year. I'd also quietly covered a shortfall in the second year that I'd never mentioned. The tax bill, $1,200. The time Tanya needed her wisdom teeth removed and they hadn't hit their deductible yet, and Scott called me from the parking lot of the oral surgeon's office sounding sheepish. That had been $860. I kept going. When I was done, I'd filled 2 pages of the legal pad. The total sat at the bottom, underlined twice. It was not an astronomical sum. I am not a wealthy woman. But it was real, and it was mine, and I'd given it freely every time because I believed that's what families did for each other. I still believed that. The difference now was that I understood the arrangement had never been mutual. I folded the pages carefully and put them in the shoebox. My financial advisor's name is Robert Gaffney. He's been handling my accounts since just after my husband died, and in all that time, he has never treated me like someone who didn't understand her own money, which I consider a very specific and underappreciated quality in a person. I called his office on Wednesday and made an appointment for Friday. When I sat across from him and explained the situation, I didn't editorialize. I just told him what had happened and what I decided. "I want to remove my son from my accounts," I said. "He's listed as a beneficiary on 2 of them, and I'd like to change that." Robert looked up from his notes. "Both." "Both," I said. "Any alternative beneficiaries in mind?" "My daughter Carol," I said, "and I'd like to set aside a portion for my granddaughters directly, not through Scott and Tanya. A custodial account or a trust, something that goes to the girls themselves when they're old enough. That part doesn't change." He nodded. "That's a straightforward structure. I can have the paperwork ready by Monday." "I'll also need to revisit the power of attorney," I said. "Scott is currently listed. I'd like to revoke that." He didn't blink. "We can do that today if you'd like." "I'd like it." We spent 90 minutes going through the accounts, the designations, the language of the power of attorney. Robert asked clear questions and waited for clear answers. He didn't suggest I sleep on it. He didn't ask if I was sure. He treated my decisions like they were mine to make. When I left his office, the November air had sharpened into something colder. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. Then I walked to my car. I didn't hear from Scott or Tanya for 6 days. I watered my plants. I raked the last of the leaves from the side yard. I drove myself to my doctor's appointment, a regular checkup, nothing urgent, though I found it ironic, given everything. I cooked real dinners and ate them at the table instead of on the couch. I started a book I'd been meaning to read since August. On the seventh day, Scott called. Mom. His voice had that same deliberate quality as the first call, but sharper, tighter. We need to talk about the accounts. I had expected this. Robert had notified the relevant institutions of the changes, and Scott had apparently been watching. What about them? I asked. You changed everything, without talking to me. They're my accounts, I said. I was your beneficiary. You were, I said. You're not anymore. Silence. A long one. Mom, do you understand what this looks like? It looks like a woman managing her own finances, I said. He exhaled hard. This is because of the house. You're punishing us because we asked you to think about something. No, I said. I'm making decisions about my own life because that's what adults do. You made a decision to keep my granddaughters from me unless I did what you wanted. I'm making a decision of my own. That's not what happened. Scott, I kept my voice even. Tanya told me, plainly, that visits would be paused until I was willing to reconsider. Those are her words. Roll. Step back. Confuses the girls. I paused. I wrote it down. Another silence. We're trying to think about the future, he said, his voice softening into something that was almost reasonable. We're trying to think long term. You're not getting any younger, and we want you close, and you wanted me 12 minutes away so Zoe wouldn't have to go back to the after-school program, I said. I know. Tanya mentioned it. He went quiet. I love you, I said. I love the girls, but I am not a solution to a scheduling problem. He didn't respond. Goodbye, Scott. That evening, Vivian came by with a container of her chicken soup, the one with the dill that I've been trying to replicate for 20 years and never quite managed. She didn't call ahead, just knocked and stood there with the container and her good coat and an expression that said she'd already guessed things were proceeding as predicted. Come in, I said. We sat in the kitchen, and I told her about Robert, the accounts, the phone call. She listened the way she always does, without filling the pauses. When I was finished, she stirred her soup and said, I always thought Tanya was keeping a ledger. She was, I said. We both were. The difference is mine was in a shoebox in the closet, and hers was in her head. Vivian laughed. I did too, a little, not much, but a little. Carol knows? She asked. I called her yesterday. She was upset. Not at me. Good, Vivian said. That girl has always had her priorities straight. We talked until nearly 9. Before she left, she stood in my doorway with her coat buttoned and said, You know what I keep thinking? You gave that family every safety net they had, and the moment you pulled it back, they said you were the one dropping them. I nodded. She said, Remember that. When it gets hard, remember exactly who let go first. The letter came from Scott 3 weeks later. Real paper, real envelope, his handwriting on the front. He always made his lowercase g's like tiny number 9s. His third-grade teacher called it unique penmanship. I held the envelope for a while before I opened it. Inside, 3 pages. He wrote that I had destabilized the family by making changes without warning. He wrote that Tanya was hurt, that the girls were confused, that he was trying to hold everything together. He said my choices had felt like an attack, that he didn't recognize this version of me, that he wondered if I was dealing with something he didn't know about. He did not mention the house. He did not mention Tanya's ultimatum. He did not apologize. The last paragraph said, We're still your family, Mom. But family works both ways. We need you to come back to the table ready to have a real conversation. I folded the letter and put it in the shoebox. Not because it mattered, because I'd always kept records. Carol called that Sunday as she always did. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't redirect the conversation away from the difficult parts. I told her everything, beginning to end. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I'm coming in December. Don't argue with me about it." I didn't argue. She arrived on the 9th with a carry-on and a box of the salted caramels from the shop on 5th that I've loved since she was old enough to think about presents. She stayed for 10 days. We cooked and talked and walked around the old neighborhood, pointing at houses and remembering things. She drove me to a follow-up at my doctor's office and waited in the lobby reading a magazine, and when I came out, she asked how it went and waited for the actual answer, instead of moving on. On her last night, we sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and she said, "I've been thinking about what Tanya said, that she'd restrict the visits." I nodded. "That's not how grandparents work," she said. "You don't earn access to your grandchildren by being convenient." "No," I agreed. "Zoe is going to know someday that she was used as leverage." She said it simply, without anger, just as a fact. And she's going to have to decide what to do with that. I thought about Zoe, 7 years old, gap in her front teeth, obsessed with horses, sends me drawings in the mail every few months on her own initiative. She had started this, drawing me pictures and mailing them herself, without being asked. I'd wondered at the time why. Now I thought maybe she'd been watching more carefully than any of us realized. I went back to part-time consulting in January, just 2 days a week working with a small accounting firm that had been after me for years to come in and help with some of their older estate accounts. I'd always said I was too busy. Too busy with what, exactly? I couldn't now reconstruct. It was good to have work that asked something of me that wasn't personal. Numbers are steady. They don't shift based on who's in the room. 2 and 2 is 4, whether or not someone is unhappy with you. My supervisor, a woman named Deborah who was about 35 and had the competent, slightly harried air of someone managing more than she was meant to, told me in my first week that I was the godsend. I told her I was a retired bookkeeper, and she said that was the same thing. I liked her immediately. The work helped with the quiet of the house, which was real. The house was quiet. Some mornings I woke up and the silence felt fine, and some mornings it pressed. The pressing mornings I wrote things down, what I was grateful for, what I still wanted, small dignities I'd reclaimed. I started a list at the back of a notebook. Things that are mine. The house. The chair by the window. Saturdays at the farmer's market. Vivian's chicken soup. The right to say no without explaining why. Scott did not call for 6 weeks. When he did, his voice was flat. He said Tanya had been under a lot of stress. He said the girls missed me. He said he wasn't asking me to change anything, just to meet for coffee. No agenda. I agreed to meet. Not because I believed there was no agenda, but because I also missed the girls and I thought it was worth 1 hour of my time to see where things stood. We met at the diner on Garfield, which is neutral ground, which I think we both understood. He looked tired. He ordered coffee and held the cup for a long time without drinking it. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Better than fine, honestly." He looked up. Maybe he'd expected me to say worn out. Lonely. Ready to reconsider. "I'm glad," he said, and I almost believed him. We talked for a while about safe things, the weather, his job, Zoe's latest obsession, which had moved from horses to volcanoes. He smiled when he talked about her, a real smile, and I was grateful for it. He was still in there. My son was still in there underneath all of it. "Mom," he said finally, when the coffee cups were empty, "we may have gone about this the wrong way." I waited. "The house thing, the way Tanya talked to you, I think." He stopped. Started again. "I think we made some assumptions." "You did," I said. He nodded. Not comfortably, but he nodded. "I'm not asking you to sell the house," he said. "I want that off the table." "It's been off the table," I said gently. "It was never on mine." He looked at the window for a moment. "Can we start over? I don't mean all of it. I just mean, can we try to be in each other's lives without all the rest of it?" I thought about the shoebox, the legal pad, The phone call where Tanya said roll like she was reading from a manual. I'd like that, I said, on the condition that I'm in the girls' lives because I'm their grandmother, not because it's convenient. Yeah, he said. Of course. And Scott. I waited until he looked at me. I'm not returning to the previous arrangement. The finances, the accounts. That part doesn't change. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine, briefly. He was still my son. That hadn't changed, but neither had my clarity about what I was worth. And those two things could both be true. A month later, Zoe stood on my front porch on a Saturday afternoon, her backpack on, her father's car pulling away from the curb. She was holding a folder. When I opened the door, she held it out. I made you things, she said. All the ones since the summer. Dad forgot to mail them. Inside, 11 drawings. Horses, houses, a purple volcano, and one that took me a moment to recognize. 2 figures. One taller with white hair, one small, in yellow, below them, in careful capital letters, M.E. and Grandma. I stood in the doorway, looking at that drawing for a long moment. Then I stepped back and let her in. She kicked off her shoes at the door and ran to the kitchen to see if I had apple juice, which I always do, because some things you keep in stock no matter what. We spent that afternoon doing nothing important. She told me about volcanoes for 40 minutes. We baked snickerdoodles. We watched half of an animated movie, and she fell asleep on the couch under the yellow blanket with her hair in her face. I sat in the chair across from her and watched her sleep. I had not softened, not exactly. I still had the shoebox and the legal pad and the accounts arranged the way I'd arranged them. I still had my house. I still had my Saturdays. I still knew clearly and without drama what I was willing to offer and what I was not. But I also had this, a 7-year-old asleep on my couch, snickerdoodles cooling on the rack, the sound of the furnace and the faint light of a winter afternoon coming through the curtains I had chosen for myself. It was enough, more than enough, and nobody had given it to me. I had simply stopped giving it away. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been treated like a service instead of a person, if you've ever said yes long past the point where you meant it, I want you to know that it's not too late to say no. It's not too late to close the ledger and open a new one in your own name. Leave a comment if this has ever happened to you. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, follow along. There are more stories where this one came from. I spent a lot of time since all of this happened, thinking about how it started. Not with the phone call from Scott that Tuesday morning, though that was when things became visible. It started much earlier. The first time I said yes when I meant something closer to, I suppose, or I don't want to make this difficult. Those two things are not the same as yes, but I said the word and moved on, and so did everyone else. And over time, the word yes became the only answer anyone expected from me. That's how these arrangements form. Not through cruelty, not usually. Through habit. Through the slow accumulation of small accommodations that each seemed reasonable on their own. $11,000 to bridge a gap. $860 for a dental bill. A school enrollment fee here, a tax shortfall there. None of it was demanded from me in a way that felt wrong in the moment. It was always just this once, always just until things settled. And I said yes, every time, because I loved my son and I wanted to be useful, and I think, if I'm honest, because I was afraid of what the word no might cost me. What I didn't understand then was that the cost of always saying yes was accumulating too. I just couldn't see the bill. When Tanya told me that visits would be paused until I reconsidered, something clarified in me that I hadn't expected. Not anger, not exactly, more like a long, blurred image finally coming into focus. I could see, suddenly and completely, what the arrangement had always been. Not a relationship, a system. I was a functioning part of that system, and the moment I stopped functioning as expected, access to my own granddaughter became a bargaining chip. That clarity was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honesty, even the kind that arrives late, has a way of making the next right step obvious. I called Robert. I changed the accounts. I revoked the power of attorney. I did these things not as punishment. I want to be clear about that. But because a person who has been treated as a resource rather than a human being is not obligated to keep resourcing. What I had given freely, I had every right to redirect. What I had signed away in moments of trust, I had every right to reclaim. There is a kind of intelligence that only develops through difficulty, not book intelligence, not the kind I used for 23 years of bookkeeping, but the kind that comes from watching what happens when you finally hold a line. You learn who was actually there for you and who was there for what you provided. That's not a comfortable lesson, but it's a real one. Zoe showing up on my porch with 11 drawings she'd saved since summer. That mattered to me more than I can say. Not because it meant everything was resolved, but because it reminded me that the relationship I actually wanted had never required me to sell my house or dissolve my life into a calendar. It required only that I be present and that I remain myself. Those are two things I can offer without diminishing. Those are two things no one can ask me to sell. I kept the shoebox. I kept the legal pad. I kept the house. Some days I walk through the rooms the same way I did the morning after Scott's first call, and I think, this is mine. Not defiantly, just truthfully. That's enough. That has always been enough. It just took me a while to believe it.